What if the greatest threat to ancient empires was not the enemy army at their gates, but the memory of the women who dared to fight them? This question alone shakes the foundations of everything we think we know about ancient and medieval history. We grow up hearing about kings, generals, conquests, and heroic victories. Yet almost nothing is said about the women who stood on the front lines, who bled, who resisted, and who paid the highest price when they lost. And the silence surrounding them is not accidental. It was crafted, calculated, and enforced across generations. Imagine a chronicler sitting by candlelight, choosing what to write and what to bury forever. When a man was defeated, the narrative often transformed him into a tragic or cautionary figure. But when a woman warrior was captured, her defeat became something far more uncomfortable for the political order. These women defied gender norms, challenged military hierarchies, and symbolized resistance that rulers did not want. Remembered. Their bravery contradicted the image of female fragility used to justify power structures. So instead of preserving their names, chroniclers erased them. Instead of documenting their final moments, they hid them behind vague descriptions, distorted events, or simply allowed their stories to disappear in the gaps of history. And here lies the chilling part. Every erased woman represents not only a lost life, but a stolen narrative. Entire communities once whispered about these warriors, about their leadership, their tactics, their courage. Yet the official records turned them into ghosts. This deliberate erasure served as a warning to other women, a silent punishment meant to echo across the centuries. It is not just a historical omission. It is a political act, a form of violence carried out with ink, parchment, and silence. As we open this hidden world together, you might start recognizing patterns intentionally buried by empires, kingdoms, and religious authorities. And maybe you will notice how much of what we call historical truth is actually curated memory, filtered to maintain control. Have you ever felt that something crucial was missing from the stories you learned? Stay with me, because what you will uncover next might challenge everything you thought you understood about the past. Before we move forward, tell me what this awakening stirs in you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your experience, or your perspective on how history chooses what to remember and what to hide. And do not forget to like this video and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. Your engagement helps keep these buried stories alive. Now take a breath as we continue, because the next layers of this truth run even deeper, and they pull us toward a path the Chronicles never wanted us to walk. The deeper you go into the forgotten layers of ancient and medieval history, the more you notice the shadows left behind by those who controlled the narrative. And when it comes to defeated female warriors, the Chronicles did something even more revealing than silence. They hid the punishments, not because those punishments were insignificant, but because they were so extreme, so politically charged, so morally compromising that recording them would expose the very cruelty of the systems that claimed to represent order and civilization. What remained were sanitized notes, vague descriptions, or carefully shaped myths that avoided revealing what really happened when a woman dared to take up arms and lost. Imagine a battlefield after a brutal confrontation. The bodies are still on the ground. The smoke has barely lifted. And soldiers loyal to the victorious ruler begin identifying the dead and captured. Male prisoners were often registered, counted, and sometimes even integrated into political agreements. But when they encountered a woman who had fought with skill, strategy, and ferocity, the reaction shifted. Her existence itself was a threat. She was living proof that the hierarchy they defended was fragile, that women could lead, that women could inspire, that women could win. And so the punishment served a dual purpose: to destroy her physically and to destroy the symbolic power she represented. Many ancient and medieval regimes believed that the visibility of a woman warrior could destabilize entire regions. It challenged the belief that only men could embody strength, that only men could defend their people. So when these women were captured, The objective was not just to break them, but to erase the possibility that others would follow their path. They faced rituals of humiliation specifically designed to strip away their identity, to reduce them to nothing more than a warning. These acts were so degrading that chroniclers chose not to write them, not out of compassion, but out of fear. Fear that exposing such brutality would undermine the legitimacy of the victors. Some empires enforced collective punishments that targeted not just the woman, but her entire lineage. The logic behind this was calculated. If a single woman had once commanded warriors or led a rebellion, the idea of female leadership needed to be extinguished at the root. The Chronicles, therefore, became accomplices in this ideological operation. They spoke of triumphs, victories, divine justice, moral righteousness, but they concealed the darker methods used to eliminate those who defied expectation. When you read between the lines of these ancient texts, you begin to notice strange absences. Stories of battles where hundreds of prisoners are listed, yet the women who fought are not mentioned. Accounts of punishments described in detail for men, but suspiciously vague when referring to female captives. These absences reveal more than the words themselves. They reveal a coordinated effort to hide a form of violence reserved specifically for women who challenged power. And the silence becomes even heavier when you realize that, if these acts had been publicly recorded, they would have exposed the hypocrisy behind the so-called noble wars of the past. As this hidden landscape unfolds, the brutality that was kept off the official pages becomes a crucial piece of the truth, a truth that was never meant to reach us, but that still echoes, buried beneath layers of selective memory and intentional omission. The deeper we move into the territories hidden beneath official narratives, the clearer it becomes that defeated female warriors were treated differently, not only because they fought, but because their bodies carried symbolic weight that frightened rulers. After the punishments that chroniclers refused to write, there was another layer of domination that remained equally unspoken: the transformation of these women into living trophies. Empires understood that conquering a territory was one kind of victory, but conquering the image of a woman who had dared to resist was another form of triumph entirely. Her capture became a political message, a reminder etched into the psyche of everyone who witnessed her fate. In many ancient and medieval societies, a woman who fought was perceived as an anomaly, a disruption of the natural order. So when she was defeated, rulers sought to re-establish the hierarchy through symbolism. Her body became a display, not of her strength, not of her courage, but of the empire's authority. The message was clear. The empire not only defeated an enemy, it crushed the very idea of female defiance. This symbolic appropriation was often more brutal than physical punishment itself, because it turned a human being into an object meant to communicate fear. Imagine a captured female commander being paraded through a city before execution or imprisonment. She was no longer treated as a soldier, or even as a prisoner of war, but as a representation of everything the victors wanted eradicated. Her armor, if she wore any, would be stripped, her weapons taken as spoils. Sometimes her hair was cut as a mark of dishonor, a gesture intended to visually erase her identity. Chroniclers described these events in cryptic terms, using phrases like, "she was dealt with according to custom," carefully avoiding any detail that would reveal the political spectacle behind these actions. In some regions, the bodies of defeated women warriors were used to justify expansion or violence. Their capture was portrayed as divine approval for military conquest. The empire positioned itself as the defender of order, while the woman became a symbol of chaos, even though she had fought with discipline, loyalty, and often with motives far more noble than those of the armies that crushed her. This inversion of meaning served one purpose: to ensure that her resistance would never inspire others. As you examine patterns across cultures and time periods, the repetition is unsettling. The woman warrior was transformed into either a threat or a trophy, depending on how useful her image was to the rulers. But both roles stole her humanity. What makes this even more disturbing is that these symbolic transformations were often omitted deliberately, leaving us with only fragments that hint at something darker beneath the surface. Chroniclers preserved the glory of the victors, but hid the rituals that communicated domination through the suffering of women. This strategic erasure ensured that future generations would never see these women as heroes or leaders. They would, instead, appear as footnotes, distortions, or complete absences. And the silence around these symbolic acts of domination shaped the historical memory of entire cultures, reinforcing the idea that female strength was unnatural, dangerous, and ultimately punishable. The deeper we go, the more evident it becomes that these omissions were never accidental. They were part of a larger system designed to control not only bodies, but also narratives, ensuring that the power structure remained intact even centuries after the last battle ended. The further we travel into the shadows left by ancient and medieval narratives, the more we realize that the battlefield was not the only place where these women were defeated. Their second and perhaps most devastating defeat happened at the hands of those who wrote history. Chroniclers, often seen as guardians of truth, were deeply involved in shaping political memory, and when they encountered the existence of female warriors, they faced a dilemma. Record their achievements and risk legitimizing female strength, or erase them to protect the order they served. Most chose erasure, others chose distortion, and some deliberately lied. Imagine a scribe commissioned by a ruler or religious authority. He sits before parchment, quill ready, knowing that his words will become the official memory of an entire era. When he reaches an event involving a woman who led troops, commanded a fortress, or resisted an invasion, he hesitates. Her story contradicts the narrative he is expected to uphold. So he bends the truth. He diminishes her role, attributes her actions to male relatives, or replaces her entirely with anonymous figures. In some cases, archives show clear signs of tampering. Names scratched out, lines rewritten, entire passages altered to align with political agendas. What makes this manipulation even more chilling is how subtle it often was. Chroniclers rarely erased these women outright. Instead, they fragmented them. They removed motives, personalities, victories, loyalties. They kept only the parts that serve the rulers, the defeat, the humiliation, the narrative of restoration of order. This selective storytelling allowed future generations to inherit a past where female leadership appeared rare or non-existent. Not because it was, but because it had been meticulously dismantled. In many regions, it was considered dangerous for a young girl to grow up hearing stories of women who had commanded armies or defended cities. Such stories could ignite ambition, courage, or rebellion. So chroniclers reshaped these women into villains, heretics, or omens of chaos. By doing this, they ensured that even when these women's names survived, their meaning was corrupted. Their legacy became a warning rather than an inspiration. Some records were destroyed intentionally, burned during political transitions or religious purges. Others were rewritten centuries later, when new powers sought to erase evidence of female resistance to strengthen their own ideological narratives. The result is a historical landscape full of gaps, distortions, and deliberate shadows. And every missing detail forces us to question how much of what we think is truth is actually constructed mythology. As you read the surviving fragments, you begin to see patterns too consistent to be coincidence. Whole lineages of women erased, battles described in detail, but mysteriously lacking any mention of the female commanders known through oral traditions, chronicles that contradict archaeological evidence. Each of these elements points to a systematic effort to silence women who once stood at the center of pivotal historical moments. And now, standing at this crossroads between what was written and what was deliberately hidden, it becomes impossible not to wonder what else was altered, what else was quietly removed, and how different our understanding of power would be if those voices had survived intact. Before we move forward, tell me, What do you think happened to the stories that were never allowed to exist on paper? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your interpretation of this silence that stretches across centuries. As you look deeper into the places where official history falls silent, another layer of control begins to emerge. The public rituals created to humiliate defeated female warriors. These ceremonies were not improvised acts of cruelty. They were structured, symbolic, and calculated, designed to send a clear message to entire populations. Even when chroniclers softened the details or erased them entirely, the traces of these rituals appear in scattered accounts, foreign sources, or contradictory passages that reveal what the dominant culture attempted to hide. And behind those faint echoes lies a system crafted specifically to dismantle the identity of any woman who dared to fight. When a male leader was defeated, his humiliation often came through political displays of submission. But for women, the humiliation was deeply personal. It attacked not only their status as warriors, but their identity as women within societies that rigidly define gender roles. A captured female warrior represented a collapse of the established order. Her courage disrupted the narrative that women were passive, fragile, or dependent. So when she was paraded before the public, the ritual sought to redefine her image, not through strength, but through enforced vulnerability. In many regions, these rituals began by stripping away symbols of authority. Armor removed, hair cut, clothing changed to signify disgrace. The transformation was deliberate. The empire needed the crowd to see not a soldier, not a leader, but a warning. By altering her appearance, the rulers attempted to erase the visual memory of the warrior she had been. The public display served as a staged performance, a political narrative written in real time, where the woman became both the protagonist and the object of the message. Some accounts hint at elaborate ceremonies held at city gates or public squares. The woman was forced to walk alone, surrounded by soldiers who represented the power she had opposed. The crowd's reaction, whether orchestrated or spontaneous, reinforced the ruler's dominance. Jeering, silence, or ritual gestures were part of a choreography meant to teach onlookers that resistance carried a cost far greater than defeat on the battlefield. The chroniclers rarely describe these moments in detail, often using vague expressions like, "She was displayed according to custom." But the absence of specifics reveals the truth. What happened was so degrading that writing it openly would expose the cruelty of systems that claimed moral superiority. These rituals extended beyond the public square. In some regions, defeated women were forced to perform acts of submission, gestures that symbolized the restoration of male authority. These gestures were not random. They were rooted in cultural myths and traditions that linked female obedience to social stability. By forcing a warrior to enact these symbols, rulers tried to rewrite her story from defiance to defeat. It was an attempt to overwrite memory, to turn a fighter into a lesson. Even after the ritual ended, the consequences followed her. She carried the stigma imposed by the ceremony, a mark that made reintegration nearly impossible. Some women were imprisoned, others enslaved or exiled. But the true sentence was the destruction of identity. She was no longer remembered for her leadership or her resistance. She was remembered, if at all, for the humiliation imposed upon her. And if these rituals were effective, it was because chroniclers played their part. They minimized, disguised, or erased the most brutal elements, allowing future generations to inherit sanitized narratives. What remains today are the shadows of these ceremonies, faint outlines of a machinery designed not just to punish, but to rewrite the meaning of female courage. When the rituals of public humiliation ended, the story of a defeated female warrior did not fade into silence. It simply moved out of sight. What happened behind the walls of ancient and medieval prisons was rarely recorded, yet these spaces were crucial in shaping the fate of women who challenged authority. The chroniclers avoided describing these places for a reason. They were designed not merely for confinement, but for transformation, for erasure, for the slow dismantling of the spirit. And when you begin to examine the indirect clues left behind, a grim architecture of control reveals itself. Female prisons, when mentioned at all, were portrayed as places of containment. But the reality was far more complex. These institutions were constructed to enforce obedience, to break down any trace of autonomy that a woman warrior carried within her. Unlike male prisoners of war, who might be held temporarily for negotiations or ransom, captured women often disappeared into facilities deliberately placed far from public view. Isolation was part of the punishment, out of sight, out of memory, out of history. Inside these walls, the women were subjected to conditions that chroniclers described in euphemisms like appropriate discipline or necessary correction. These phrases concealed harsher truths. Some prisons functioned as labor centers, where women were forced into exhausting tasks that drained their physical strength. Others acted as indoctrination spaces, overseen by officials or religious authorities determined to reshape the women's identity. Their goal was not only to hold them, but to redefine them, stripping away the defiance that had once led them onto the battlefield. There are scattered references to specialized wings or chambers designated for high-risk female captives, a term that reveals more than it hides. A woman was considered high risk, not because she posed a physical threat, but because her story did. Her influence, her example. Within these spaces, punitive routines were developed to break the psychological resilience of warriors who refused to conform. The silence of the archives suggests that the methods used were severe, yet intentionally omitted. Some accounts from neighboring cultures, foreign travelers, or later historians hint at practices that were meant to recondition the women through deprivation, control of personal identity, or forced adherence to rituals intended to reinforce societal roles. When a woman had commanded troops or defied a king, she became a symbolic danger. Making her invisible was not enough. The system needed to ensure she would never have the strength to reclaim her voice. In certain regions, prisons also served as places where political experimentation occurred. Authorities tested methods of breaking female resistance, using strategies that blended physical pressure with psychological manipulation. A warrior who once inspired loyalty had to be transformed into someone who symbolized defeat. These institutions contributed to that transformation through routines that erased individuality. Identical clothing, imposed silence, repetitive tasks, restricted movement. Every rule was designed to diminish the memory of the battlefield within her. And then, there were the records that vanished, documents burned, logs rewritten, names replaced by numbers. These administrative silences form patterns too consistent to ignore. When you follow the traces, they point toward a coordinated effort to ensure that whatever happened inside these prisons would never shape public memory. The chroniclers, once again, became guardians of the official version of events. By omitting these stories, they protected the reputation of the institutions that enforced order. Step by step, the path from the battlefield to the prison cell reveals a system meticulously crafted to eliminate more than physical resistance. It sought to erase influence, to undermine inspiration, to bury the idea that women had ever fought, commanded, or resisted with the same force as men. And behind those walls, unseen and unrecorded, the echoes of that struggle continue to reverberate through the centuries. As the doors of those forgotten prisons closed, another kind of disappearance began, one that extended far beyond confinement. For many defeated female warriors, the true punishment was not physical captivity, but historical erasure. Their stories were not simply ignored, they were deliberately dissolved into anonymity. When you trace the few surviving references across ancient and medieval sources, you begin to see a pattern of women who once shaped the course of conflicts, yet vanished almost instantly from official records. Their names, origins, alliances, victories, and motivations were systematically removed, leaving only faint shadows behind. This erasure served a purpose: A woman who fought, who led, who defied social roles and stood against powerful rulers, represented a challenge to the structures that defined female existence. As long as her story survived, it could inspire others. So authorities devised a different kind of sentence, one that punished not only the woman, but the possibility of her legacy. They allowed her defeat to stand, but erased everything else. Her courage was buried. Her leadership was denied. Her identity was smoothed over, until she became nothing more than a whisper beneath layers of controlled memory. Some chronicles mention a woman or a female figure without giving details, as if the writer were intentionally withholding vital information. This vagueness was not accidental. It allowed the chroniclers to acknowledge the existence of women on the battlefield, while preventing their stories from becoming powerful narratives. In many cases, the chroniclers went further. They replaced women's achievements with male characters, attributing their strategies, victories, or commands to brothers, husbands, or unnamed soldiers. Entire rebellions were reframed to remove female leadership, ensuring that the idea of women as warriors remained unthinkable for generations. The mechanisms of disappearance went far beyond written accounts. Oral traditions that preserved the memory of these women were often suppressed, declared dangerous, or labeled heretical. Communities were discouraged from repeating their names. In some regions, even families were pressured to hide their connection to women who had fought, fearing punishment or stigma. The erasure became generational, a silence maintained across time not only by chroniclers but by fear itself. Archaeological evidence sometimes contradicts these intentional silences. Graves containing weapons alongside female remains, inscriptions describing leadership roles for women, or foreign sources documenting female commanders all challenge the sanitized narratives developed by dominant powers. Yet even these physical traces were often dismissed, reinterpreted, or minimized by later historians, continuing the cycle of denial. The deeper you look, the more apparent it becomes that erasure was not a passive oversight, but a calculated strategy. For many of these women, defeat marked the beginning of a second battle, one they did not survive. They fought political systems, cultural expectations, and historical narratives engineered to make them disappear. And the most devastating part is that those systems succeeded far too often. The gaps we find today are not accidental voids. They are engineered absences, the result of decisions made by people who feared what these women represented. And now, after uncovering these patterns, it is impossible not to wonder how different our understanding of the past would be if these silenced voices had been allowed to remain. How many leaders, strategists, and defenders were lost to deliberate forgetting? How many stories were never given the chance to shape the world beyond their time? Before we continue, tell me what this disappearance makes you feel or think. Leave a comment sharing a word, a sentence, or even a question that this silence awakens in you. Once you begin to understand how these women vanished from prisons and chronicles, another layer of this hidden history emerges from the very ground where they fought. Ancient and medieval battlefields were not only places of open combat, they were also sites where silent, unspeakable practices occurred. And among these unrecorded acts were the extreme measures reserved specifically for women who proved to be true military threats. These actions were seldom written down, yet they left behind enough scattered evidence to expose a reality even darker than the erasure that followed. Across different cultures, captains and commanders feared female warriors for reasons that went beyond strategy. A woman fighting with discipline and ferocity challenged the belief systems that upheld social order. Her mere presence on the battlefield questioned long-standing doctrines about gender, loyalty, and strength. So rulers and armies developed practices intended not only to defeat such women, but to send a psychological message to all who witnessed or heard of them. These measures were crafted to extinguish the idea that a woman could stand against an empire. Some accounts from foreign observers describe peculiar battlefield behaviors, soldiers ordered to isolate female fighters rather than treat them like any other opponent, commanders instructing their troops to surround these women quickly, ensuring that they were captured alive rather than killed in the chaos of battle. This focus on capture, rather than elimination, reveals the deeper intent behind these actions. A defeated male enemy was one thing. A defeated woman who had commanded respect posed a symbolic danger that required special handling. Other passages, buried in obscure manuscripts or referenced indirectly by later historians, hint at practices involving psychological warfare. In some regions, armies used symbolic gestures intended to strip women of their warrior identity, even before they were officially captured. This included targeting their armor, removing emblems they carried, or forcing them into positions of vulnerability to make their presence on the battlefield appear unnatural. These acts were not spontaneous. They were codified responses to an enemy who threatened the foundations of social ideology. There are also indications that certain commanders employed ritualized acts after battles, not for the purpose of honoring the dead, but for rewriting the meaning of what had occurred. When female warriors were found among the fallen, their bodies were sometimes moved away from those of male soldiers. Their wounds were deliberately misrepresented in reports to ensure that future retellings would minimize their combat skill. Some chronicles even mention corrected descriptions of battles, a phrase that implies the manipulation of battlefield evidence to prevent the acknowledgement of women who fought effectively. In neighboring cultures or rival states, however, some chroniclers wrote down what the dominant powers refused to admit. They described scenes where female warriors were subjected to specialized interrogations or forced displays meant to intimidate their communities. These accounts reveal a widespread understanding that a woman who fought represented far more than an individual threat. She symbolized an alternative future, one where leadership and courage were not restricted by gender. As you sift through these fragments, a disturbing pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The battlefield was not simply a place of physical conflict. It was a stage for shaping memory. Extreme practices against women were designed to ensure that no tale of their bravery would survive unaltered. The victors controlled not only the outcome of the battle, but also the meaning of the women who fought in it. And through these concealed acts, history itself was weaponized, transformed into a tool that reinforced obedience and erased defiance before it could take root. If the battlefield shaped the first layer of silence, and the Chronicles solidified the second, the persecution that followed ensured the silence would endure across generations. For the rare women who survived their capture or escaped the machinery of humiliation and confinement, life did not return to normal. They carried with them a stigma carefully engineered by the systems that sought to erase their existence. Their survival alone represented a threat. And so the persecution continued long after the dust of the battlefield had settled, extending into villages, cities, and even entire regions that feared the symbolic power these women embodied. A woman who had once worn armor or commanded allies became a target not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented. She was a living contradiction to the ideology that justified political and social hierarchies. Even if she returned home broken, stripped of weapons and identity, her presence alone challenged the narrative imposed by the victors. Authorities understood this, and they moved swiftly to ensure she could not shape future events. Surveillance, forced relocation, and social isolation became common strategies that chroniclers avoided documenting, leaving only faint echoes of these practices in peripheral texts. In some regions, survivors were forbidden from speaking about the battles they fought. They were pressured to deny their role, sometimes coerced into adopting new identities, or entering institutions that enforced obedience. Families associated with these women were monitored, questioned, or punished, creating an atmosphere of fear that ensured the silence remained intact. Generations grew up knowing that even acknowledging these women's bravery could invite retaliation. As a result, communities internalized the silence treating these women as figures who existed only in private whispers. There were cases where surviving women attempted to rebuild their lives, but the mark of defiance followed them everywhere. They were excluded from traditional roles, denied access to certain forms of work or political voice, and subjected to rituals designed to reassert social order. Some were forced into marriages intended to erase their past. Others were declared outcasts, considered unfit for communal life. This ostracism was not a byproduct of their actions, but a deliberate extension of political control. If their stories remained dangerous, then the women themselves had to remain marginalized. Even decades later, the repercussions continued. Descendants of female warriors often carried an inherited stigma. In certain regions, they were barred from holding positions of influence or were kept under subtle forms of scrutiny. The idea was simple. If the memory of the warrior could not be erased completely, then the shadow of her defiance had to be contained. This generational control ensured that the impact of these women did not spread beyond the limits imposed by the victors. Foreign chronicles occasionally preserved glimpses of these survivors. Travelers described meeting women whose demeanor carried the weight of battles no one was allowed to speak of. They noted the contradictions between local silence and the strength that still lingered in the eyes of these forgotten fighters. These accounts, though rare, reveal an emotional reality hidden beneath the official narratives. They expose the lengths to which societies went to contain not only the physical power of these women, but the symbolic force of their survival. What remains today are fragments, distant mentions, ambiguous inscriptions, and archaeological traces that contradict the silence. Each clue suggests that the persecution of these women did not end with their defeat. It continued, reshaping their lives, their families, and their communities, ensuring that even in survival, they would remain ghosts, present yet denied, powerful yet unacknowledged, visible only to those willing to look beyond the boundaries of the written past. As we reach the final layer of this hidden history, the significance of what has been deliberately erased becomes impossible to ignore. The defeated female warriors whose names were removed from chronicles, whose bodies were used as instruments of domination, whose lives were controlled even after survival, have left a legacy that persists quietly in the structures and biases of our modern world. Their stories, though obscured, challenge us to examine not only what we know about the past, but also how the absence of truth continues to shape the perception of women in positions of power today. These women, erased from formal records, still influence history by the weight of their absence. The hidden legacy is evident in the way historical narratives often glorify male conquest while reducing female agency to myth or anecdote. A warrior woman who achieved tactical brilliance or led troops is remembered at best as a footnote, at worst, completely forgotten. Modern historians sometimes uncover fragments, shards of correspondence, accounts written by outsiders, artifacts, that hint at the courage, leadership, and resilience that once existed but was systematically silenced. Every discovery of a hidden document or overlooked inscription challenges centuries of selective memory, reminding us that power is not only wielded on the battlefield, but also in the archives, libraries, and memory of societies. Understanding this legacy is essential because it influences more than academic knowledge. It shapes cultural norms and social expectations. When entire generations are taught a history that underrepresents women's leadership, the consequence is a society that undervalues female strength. Recognizing the deliberate erasure of these women offers insight into how power has been maintained and how narratives are crafted to reinforce control. The victories and defeats of these female warriors were never just about warfare. They were about shaping collective consciousness, about determining who gets remembered and who is made invisible. And those patterns continue, subtly, in how leadership, courage, and influence are culturally framed today. By uncovering these hidden truths, we gain a clearer understanding of the intersections between gender, power, and historical memory. we see that the suppression of female agency was a calculated strategic tool, and that even centuries later, the shadows of these actions influence perception and recognition. Acknowledging this hidden legacy is a step toward reclaiming stories that were never meant to survive, honoring the courage of women who fought, endured, and resisted in ways that empires feared. It also challenges us to question which other narratives have been muted, which voices remain unheard, and how history might be rewritten if the silenced were finally given a platform. If you've followed this journey to the very end, you've witnessed more than just battles and punishment. You've glimpsed the deliberate shaping of memory and the ongoing impact of historical silencing. Let me ask you now, how does it feel to realize that the women who defied armies, empires, and centuries of suppression are finally being remembered? Leave a comment sharing your reaction, your reflections, or even a word that captures what this story evokes in you. If this exploration has changed your perspective, make sure to hit the like button and check if you're subscribed to the channel. By doing so, you continue supporting the uncovering of stories deliberately hidden from view. There's more history waiting to be revealed, and your engagement ensures these voices are heard, remembered, and honored.